Hello everybody, and welcome to the first of this season's online seminars run by the Seaside Heritage Network. And today's seminar is about museums and the seaside story. And there are lots of museums in seaside towns, and so the aim of today's seminar was to focus on how these museums tell the story of the growth of their town as a holiday destination and the history of seaside tourism in their area. And I have to say that this has been one of the most difficult seminars to organise because there are plenty of museums out there in seaside towns, but it's been very difficult to persuade them to contribute to today's seminars. We emailed a lot of museums and some of them simply didn't reply. I guess that's kind of pressures on staffing and things. And quite a few others didn't want to take part. And then on top of that, one of our speakers from Llandudno Museum had to drop out on Monday. So we've been very lucky to find a last minute replacement. So I'll introduce him later. Anyway, our first speaker today is Kate Hebditch from Weymouth Museum, where she's the collections and volunteer coordinator. And I met Kate at our big day out at Weston-super-Mare in September and asked her if she'd like to contribute to this seminar. And she immediately said yes. And you kind of think, well, if only everybody who works in the Seaside Museum was like her. So Kate's got a lot of experience working in museums. She's previously worked at Brecknock Museum, the Museum of London, North Fort, and Dorchester County Museum. And she's also a former mayor of Dorchester. And so her presentation is titled Health, Wealth and Happiness, Collecting Weymouth's Seaside Heritage.
Thank you. So yeah, if we can start sharing, great. Yes, Weymouth Museum, I should say at the outset, is not open at present, and more on that story later. So the museum has rather a checkered history. There are references throughout the sort of 18th and 19th centuries to museums that appeared and then disappeared, and collections that were shown and disappeared. So it wasn't until the 1970s that Weymouth Borough established its own museum. And this was housed in a former school, which you see in the picture on the left. So that stayed there and collected material from Weymouth, collected lots to do with Weymouth and its seaside heritage, until 1989, when basically the Borough of Weymouth and Portland privatised the museum. So it loaned all the collections to Devonish Brewery, which opened its own museum and time walk in Brewers Quay, the former brewery, 19th century brewery that you see in the picture on the right. So it's had a very checkered history there. The Brewers Quay started to decline. There were shops in that development. They started to decline, and in 2010, it closed. Since then, the building, Brewers Quay, has been sold off 5 times in 12 years. And the museum has popped up from time to time, almost as squatters in that building, and shown its collections there now and then, and in a pop-up museum in a shopping street. But it's had a checkered history, as I say. So it's recently put in for a Heritage Lottery grant, and it will be hopefully going back into the new restored Brewers Quay building in 2 to 3 years' time. So at this point, we're working on what stories we want to tell in a new museum. So we got the chance to do it all from fresh. So what makes Weymouth Weymouth? It's got a long history. It was an important Tudor town. Merchants there brought wealth to the town. Pilgrims would leave from Weymouth to go to Santiago. So they are early tourists in a way. And then again, people left from Weymouth to go to the New World. How we present ourselves to the outside world, there's a lot we can learn from early guidebooks on how Weymouth thought of itself. They took themselves down rather a lot in the past. I think we need to be more positive about our story. And Weymouth has in many ways had things done to it from the outside. So some of you may know that the 2012 Olympics, the sailing events were held in Weymouth. And that was very much done to Weymouth by the London 2012 committee. So I think it's important now that we tell the stories that Weymouth wants to tell to the world. So themes that we're developing are health, wealth, and happiness, basically. So Weymouth has an interesting health story. The plague came into Weymouth, the Black Death, in 1348. And then, of course, sea bathing took off. And now there is new COVID research going on in Weymouth hospitals. Health, wealth, work in Weymouth. So it started off as a port and fishing industries. Then became the brewing industry became very strong, and holiday accommodation, things that were servicing the tourist industry. And happiness, it was very much a holiday town, and it's also a party town. Lots of people go to Weymouth for New Year. There are shows on there. We want to collect much more of the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s stories of Weymouth as a party town. We also have warfare, which doesn't quite fit into that. The photograph there shows the preparations for D-Day and the black support troops who were there to load the vessels and so on. They weren't actually allowed to fight. They were providing the support services. So sea bathing, the fad for that was very much when Weymouth came into its own. So Ralph Allen, the entrepreneur, I suppose is the best way to describe him, from Bath, was one of the first people to recognise Weymouth as a sea bathing place, and he built a bathing machine for himself. And on the right, you can see the descriptions of how Weymouth was a fantastic bay for sea bathing. It's very sheltered, it's a gentle slope, and it's nice clear waters, or it was at that point anyway. So between 1789 and 1805, George III took to coming to Weymouth for his holidays, and sea bathing for his health. This is a print at the time of his bathing hut, and the band would play. I thought the band were on the shore, but this print shows them actually in the water with him. So they would be playing the national anthem and so on. This is one of the guidebooks at the time, which has got the prices of bathing machines and how they would provide you with 2 towels. On the right-hand side, the picture shows what is supposed to be George III's bathing machine, which is in the museum collections. It's currently in pieces, pending the new museum. And I think it's probably a bit of a Trigger's broom sort of artifacts. How Trigger in Only Fools and Horses said he'd had the same broom for 30 years and it had had 6 heads and 12 handles. So I think with George III's bathing machine, there have been quite a lot of replacements over the years since it left George III's presence. So we've got prints from that period which show George III in Weymouth meeting all the gentry, meeting the mayor here. The mayor had a wooden leg, so he couldn't bow deeply. So it said the populace put up a statue to George III, the grateful inhabitants, to him, and it is a very splendid statue on Weymouth Esplanade. And alongside sea bathing, there was a lot of sort of hot and cold water baths available to visitors for their health. And that picture shows George III's bath from Gloucester Lodge, which is also in the museum. And again, in pieces, waiting its new place in the new museum. Some of our Georgian material will be on show next year at Dorset Museum, where they have an exhibition on Jane Austen's Dorset. So the Georgian material would be part of that. So having been established as a place to go for your health in Georgian times, we move on to it becoming more popular in Victorian times and the railway arriving and more people making their way to Weymouth for their holidays and for their health. It's a time when guidebooks start and the souvenir trade. So that's an early patch box up at the top there, but we have multiple souvenirs of all sorts in the museum. The jug there at the bottom is a souvenir jug from Portland Prison, would you believe it? So people would actually go and look at the prisoners on Portland, and they sold souvenirs with pictures of this, which is extraordinary. So moving into the Victorian era and later, it's very much your absolute classic seaside. So we have sand sculpture, we have the charabancs arriving, we have Punch and Judy, of course, and we do have a Punch and Judy person there every summer still. We've got the donkeys in the picture at the bottom there, with goat carts as well as donkeys. These little carts pulled by goats. I don't know how unruly they were, but there are several pictures of those. So guidebooks, we have a range throughout Weymouth's history, from the early days of tourism, showing off its fine esplanade, moving on to the gossipy guide to Weymouth and changing styles completely to the more seaside postcard style of design on the right-hand side there in the 60s or 70s. And as part of our collections, we have the most fantastic collection of photographs. I think with seaside photography, the town was full of photographers who came to take pictures of people who were on holiday. So they would take them, print them up, and then you could buy them from the seafront. Alongside that is the postcard industry. So bang in the middle of this picture, underneath the ship there, you can see there's a postcard stall. So postcards and photographs are absolutely key to Weymouth's tourist trade at that time. So we got some really lovely images like this one from the 1910s with the Punch and Judy on the left there and the crowd watching it. One of donkeys on the beach, again, sort of late 1910s, I think, maybe just about to 1920, 1910s. And you can see the bathing huts are still very much in use then. They've changed a bit in style, a bit more sort of garden shed-like, but still a strong presence on Weymouth's beachfront. Not everybody seemed to enjoy it, though. There's some very gloomy-looking people amongst our collections, but some fantastic photographs of showing how people are using the town, coming on holiday, what they're doing on the holiday. And then both postcards and photographs showing the range of holiday activities. So the vaudeville stall on the beachfront there with the sort of Pierrot shows. Again, the bathing huts, large ones, in the coloured postcard at the bottom there. Ice cream stalls, donkeys again. People bringing their own sort of beach tents. But every holiday activity you can think of could be found on Weymouth Esplanade. So skee ball, which I think was some sort of large-scale bagatelle type game that came from America. Boat hire. They had just about during the Olympics they had a large screen of the Olympic activities. Back at this time, they had a test match scoreboard. So even though you were on holiday, you could keep in touch with what was happening in the test match. No actual screen of action, but they put up the scores on the beachfront there. And you can see cars starting to arrive, so it's starting to be the beginning of car transport for your holiday. And in the middle is Crazy Golf. I don't know when that first started. That would be interesting to find out the history of Crazy Golf, but certainly there are photographs of that in the collection. And the nighttime illuminations, which don't get photographed very often, and look rather better there than they do in current times, I think. So that was a quick run through of the sort of collections we have. The fantastic images. So we are applying for a grant to digitize our images alongside developing the museum. So we can use those images in the new displays and make them available to people online, because that's a real strength of the collection. But our Heritage Lottery grant application has gone in. We hope to hear in mid-December. And then there will be a 2-year development phase before the new museum opens. So we're really concentrating on what stories Weymouth wants to tell at this stage, and building in what the community would like to say about itself as well. So much more community involvement this time. And hopefully, before too long, a new museum for Weymouth. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Kate. And it's really nice to see that you've made happiness one of the key themes of your new museum displays. We'll have time, hopefully, for questions at the end. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into chat, and we'll put them to our speakers later on. But now I think we'll move on to our next speaker. So thanks, Kate. Our second speaker was due to have been from Llandudno Museum, but the speaker had to step down at the last minute due to family commitments. So we're very grateful to John West, who's appropriately from West Bay Discovery Centre, who literally stepped in yesterday to help us out. So West Bay Discovery Centre is a visitor centre which tells the story of West Bay, which is near Bridport in Dorset, and the surrounding Jurassic Coast area. So there's a bit of a Dorset theme emerging to today's seminar. John spent a lot of time working for Dorset County Council, and he's now chair of West Bay Discovery Centre and also a trustee of the Bridport Area Development Trust. So over to you, John.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Apologies for any rustiness in this presentation for the reasons that Duncan has mentioned. It's a short presentation, really, that aims to give an insight into what the Discovery Centre is and what we offer there. First of all, Dorset, as we mentioned, we've just heard from Kate about Weymouth Museum, and we are perhaps 20 miles further to the west up the coast at West Bay, very close to the small market town of Bridport, and slap bang in the Jurassic Coast World Heritage Site. We're located in a former Methodist chapel, and this is obviously an old picture looking at the chapel from the landward side. The chapel itself is situated right on the edge of the beach at West Bay. Going back into the 18th century, Methodism was sweeping the southwest, and Bridport in particular and West Bay were centres of nonconformist religion. There was preaching from the ships in the harbour in West Bay to the local people, the shipbuilders, and there was a demand for a permanent place of worship to be established. And the harbour commissioners at that time made available a small plot of land where the Methodist chapel that we now work in today was created. That was built in 1849 by one of the local shipbuilders, Elias Cox, using some of the same materials that would have been used in the ships. The Methodist chapel was well used over the years by locals and visitors to West Bay, but by the 1990s and 2000s, the congregations were dwindling. And in 2006, the Methodists took the decision to hand the building over to the local council, West Dorset District Council at that time, with a requirement that the building should continue to be used for community purposes. The District Council had long wanted to see a visitor centre in West Bay, and in turn they handed it over to a local charity, the Bridport Area Development Trust, in 2012. Nothing happened immediately. Funding, I think, was the main issue at that stage. I came on the scene when I moved to West Bay with my wife Sarah in 2014. We were both fascinated by the building and wanted to get involved in a project to restore it and repurpose it as a visitor centre. A small committee was put together and we sought funding, which we were successful in achieving from the Coastal Communities Fund, which was a fund which ran for a few years. And I think round 4 was where we were successful in obtaining funding, which totaled £240,000, which, with the addition of some local grants, enabled us to go to work on actually restoring the building and repurposing it as a visitor centre. Quite a lot of work was involved. There was erosion of the timbers underneath the floor. The ceiling needed to come down and be replaced. The internal walls needed to be stripped back and made waterproof. That work started in January 2017, enabling the building to be ready for opening in August 2018. But what were we to put in there? Well, that work was going on at the same time. There was obviously a requirement for a visitor centre of some shape or form, and we did a lot of consultation in the period leading up to December 2017. It was clear that people were interested in history and wanted to know more about the history of West Bay. They were also interested in natural history. The television drama Broadchurch was very topical at that time, but fortunately, in looking back in hindsight, most people felt that wasn't something that should be in the visitor centre. We're not a museum, strictly speaking. We're a hybrid, part heritage centre, part visitor centre, and part tourist information centre. And you can see some of the themes that we decided to feature in the centre. We looked for a designer, and we were very fortunate to appoint somebody called Chris Jones, who operates from Bristol and had worked in various museums, both locally and regionally, along with other sort of visitor centres. And we had a backwards and forwards exchange of ideas and suggestions with Chris over a period of about 3 or 4 months, which enabled us to work up the internal displays. He was a great source of ideas, and it was a real pleasure to work with him. What we aimed for in the centre was to have things that would attract all ages and all interests. And particularly, we were keen that the content in the centre should be as hands-on as possible. People should be able to not just look at things or read them, but be able to touch them as well. We also wanted flexibility to be able to move things around and to change displays over time with a sort of slot in, slot out type approach. Again, Chris, our designer, was very helpful with that. We also wanted to have flexible use of the building, so we ended up with 2 central display units, and you can see one of them in the bottom left picture. Those could be moved to the back wall of the building, enabling it to be used for seating or more general use as meetings. The digital microscope, which you can see in the top left picture, was a more recent addition that came in after we'd opened the centre. We saw it in another visitor centre and thought it looked interesting. It had to be imported from New Zealand, and it was quite expensive, but it proved hugely popular and continues to be very popular, particularly with young people who can bring in their finds from the beach or where else and examine them under the microscope and see the image displayed on a computer screen. One of the things which boosts our visitor numbers, and we have free admission to the centre, is changing the exhibitions. We don't change the main exhibitions, but we do have the cabinet, which I mentioned, and other parts of the centre which we can use for a seasonal exhibition. We normally have 2 seasonal exhibitions each year. We've featured things like West Bay in the wartime, local fishing, geology and fossils, and more recently a look at West Bay's development as a seaside resort. West Bay had a small but quite industrial harbour, along with the shipbuilding industry. But when in the late 1870s, shipbuilding became more large scale, the shipyard at West Bay closed. At the same time, the trade in the harbour declined significantly, so West Bay looked to convert itself to a seaside resort. It was quite keen on emulating Bournemouth or Weymouth that we've heard about already this afternoon. It didn't really achieve that for various reasons, partly land ownership, but we've looked at the grand designs that only were achieved in part as part of that recent exhibition. We operate with a part-time manager who works 26 hours a week between March and October, with reduced hours during the winter period. But our centrepiece really is our volunteer resource. We currently have around 45 volunteers who are all local to the area and are knowledgeable and very enthusiastic. And it's really the information they give to visitors and the value they add to what we have in the centre, which we think makes the centre a success. It's been great to get recognition of what we do, and I just popped in this slide, which is an extract from The Guardian a couple of years ago. As I say, we don't consider ourselves a museum, but if other people see us in that way, that's absolutely fine. And it's really nice to get feedback about what people have enjoyed. We've also entered various tourist awards over the period that we've been open, and we've been successful in being recognised for being a small visitor attraction, for our ethical approach to the centre, for being green, and also for accessibility and inclusion. Those awards have come from Dorset Tourism, South West of England, and also from Visit England, where we got a bronze award. They're great for the morale of the volunteers and the staff, and they're a good validation, really, that people locally sort of recognise the centre, and even if they haven't been in, they say, well, you must be good, you've won an award. So that's good to have that sort of feedback. We don't pursue it actively, but when we get the opportunity, it's always good. We very recently entered into a new chapter of the Discovery Centre's operation. Originally, as I mentioned, the centre was set up and run by a local charity. It had never been the intention that that would be a permanent situation, and following extensive discussions, we've entered into a new arrangement which sees the building itself transferred to an independent arm's length trust, which is overseen by Bridport Town Council. And Bridport Town Council are taking on the management and operation of the centre. The volunteers will become part of the Friends of the West Bay Discovery Centre organisation. And the Friends group will particularly focus upon research, putting on the seasonal exhibitions, and also raising additional funds. We believe that the arrangement will give greater resilience to the centre, relieve volunteers of the responsibilities of managing the building and managing the finances. And we hope it will provide a stable long-term future that the centre can continue to build upon its success. So that's the end of the presentation. I hope you found it informative, and if we have the opportunity at the end, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
That's great, John. Thank you very much. I think there's an interesting discussion to be had about what's the difference between a museum and a visitor centre. So maybe we can pick that up later. Our last speaker needs no introduction. It's our very own Kathryn Ferry. And Kathryn, as you know, is a historian specialising in the seaside. She's the author of goodness knows how many books. I've lost count, but it's at least 10. And she's got another one coming out soon, which I'm sure she'll tell you about. And she's regularly on the television talking about the British seaside. So when we were, have to say, struggling to find speakers from museums for this session, Kathryn offered to step in and present her personal take on some objects related to the seaside that are held in museums in seaside towns. So Kathryn, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. As Duncan said, this is my selection of seaside objects. So in 2020, I published a book called Seaside 100, a history of the British seaside in 100 objects. And I did think at first that that was going to be museum objects, but as it transpired, it was objects that sometimes you were just too big to fit in a museum. So, you know, I had to include the Blackpool Tower, but you're not going to find that in a museum, and donkeys and ice creams and all these things that it's more things than objects. So that doesn't mean I'm not interested in the objects. It just didn't sort of work for a publication. So this is very much museum objects I've got today, and it's pieces that I particularly liked and I have photographed around my seaside travels. There is, I'm afraid, a bit of a southern bias here. Again, I'm sorry about that. It is a product of where I live in the south. And I should say that we have had in previous seminars speakers from Showtown in Blackpool, which is definitely a new museum worth visiting, and Scarborough Museum as well. So these are just kind of things that I've picked up on. They're not all cheesy souvenirs like these, though I confess I do kind of marvel at the breadth of kitsch knickknackery that was produced to highlight, to delight holidaymakers. As you see in some of these, the present from Southend on the top there, I don't know what kind of fish that is. I think it's the salt and pepper pot. They're quite bonkers, but they're rather wonderful at the same time. But anyway, my plan this afternoon is to discuss a couple of objects from each of 8 chosen museums, and some of you in the audience I know will recognize these because I know that you're from some of these museums. I'm going to do it very quickly, so I can't say a lot of detail, but I hope that it'll kind of whet your appetite to go and visit some of these places. So I'm starting at the Georgian Seaside at Brighton Museum and Art Gallery with 2 fascinating figures who derived their celebrity and their royal patronage, indeed, from the new pastime of medicinal bathing. And we've heard about that from Kate at Weymouth. Brighton, like Weymouth, was one of the earliest seaside resorts. And because it was creating this new type of leisure, it was a new kind of destination. There were these fortunes and reputations to be made. And Martha Gunn, who you see on the left here, became very famous, inspired indeed a stereotype as a dipper. So it was her job to dip people under the waves when they came on their doctor's orders to have their medicinal dips in Brighton. And actually, I've found sort of cartoons and caricatures into the 19th century which talk about children coming to their Martha. Her name becomes a kind of archetype of this this profession of dipping. This portrait only came to Brighton Museum in 2008, and it was given by a direct descendant of Martha Gunn, who now lives in Australia. And it's much more sort of personal, I think, than any of the other depictions I've seen of her. It's just a beautiful portrait. The other picture there relates to Sheikh Din Mohammed, who was an intrepid entrepreneur who was born in India and has several interesting claims to fame. He was the first Indian to open a restaurant in London, an Indian restaurant, the first, I guess it's the first curry house, and the first Indian to publish a book in English about his travels around this country. Whereas Martha Gunn catered to outdoor sea bathing, Sheikh Mohammed created these indoor baths from 1825, giving hydropathic treatments and becoming the shampooing surgeon to King George IV and later King William IV. So this again is a gift from his descendants, this costume that you see here. And it's interesting in that it represents a mixture of sort of exotic taste, but also Regency fashions. It's got little sort of pantaloons underneath this tunic, designed to really make him stand out as somebody noteworthy in Brighton. So that's the early Seaside. I'm skipping forward quite a long way when I take you to Portsmouth Museum and Art Gallery, because whereas the Brighton ones are sort of giving you a glimpse of a seaside that you can only imagine now, these objects in the display case I've included here are very much within living memory, and they kind of provide a nostalgic window into the post-war heyday of the British seaside. It's both highly recognizable, but also quite ephemeral in some of these things. It's the brochures, but there's like a mug at the bottom, a bucket and spade, the kind of things that get broken over time, and things that you don't necessarily keep, but when you see them, they sort of bring back important memories. And I think that's something to recognize about seaside objects in museum collections. Part of their importance is their ubiquitousness. You know, we all had these things. We all had buckets and spades. We can all associate with those things. They are both everyday, but also they belong to a defined period within the year that's linked to special activities, you know, actually that's linked to holidays, which is generally a time where we're having fun and we let our hair down. And so that confers a sort of particular potency on those objects. And I think that displays like this can both capture and convey that potency. So even though they are kind of everyday objects, they're still very important. And my other object on the right hand side is a bit rarer. We all know about the Blackpool illuminations, but after the Second World War, most seaside resorts did have a kind of their own version of illuminations. Not that many of them survive, as far as I'm aware. And so this I really liked. I don't know why it's a thistle for Southsea in Hampshire, but nevertheless, it's on display there, and it is a nice and interesting survival. I take you back to Brighton now, but to the Fishing Museum, which is housed in the arches underneath the promenade. And you might think that the fishing story doesn't necessarily relate very much to the seaside story, but indeed it does have some fantastic seaside-y objects within the collection. And these ones relate to pleasure piers. So I chose the one on the left, this poster from 1877. The 77 there is 1877. It's got beautiful typography, and it's advertising aquatic entertainments on West Pier, which include races from the pier, but also something called Walking the Greasy Pole, which is open to all comers, and I anticipate probably caused a lot of uproarious mirth when people fell off said greasy pole. The other object here is obviously a very large one, and I think this is kind of like an analog arrivals and departures board with all of those arms showing the destinations for paddle steamers leaving the pier head. And sticking with piers, I'm going to take you now to Minehead Museum in Somerset. Minehead no longer has a pier, but the town's museum does have this memento of the structure lost in 1940 that you can see on the left-hand side here. By chance, this mangled fragment of iron entrance gate was dredged up in 2020, and it's now kind of rather romantic exhibit shown alongside, as you can see on the right, photographs of the pier when it still stood, and this this model that's being created to show you what it would have looked like. There's something about that sort of gnarled and kind of bashed about ironwork with all the rust on it that kind of speaks to that lost lost part of mine head's heritage. It's really nice to have a bit of that, even though it's only small. I do love a model, I'm afraid, so I'm going to include a couple of others. They don't come better than this one. Bexhill Museum in East Sussex holds the original architect's model for the groundbreaking Delaware Pavilion, designed by the German architect Erich Mendelsohn and Russian emigre architect Sergei Chermayev, which opened in 1935. This model isn't just a beautiful representation of an iconic building. The word iconic is very, very overused, but I'm using it consciously here because this genuinely is a building that had impact far beyond its location. It was structurally and in design terms, it really did change ideas about modern architecture. But this isn't just about the building, it's about the other sort of elements of this bigger scheme that you see in the model that were never built. So in particular, you can see in the center of the model, this circular open air pool, a lido, and then from that, the double-decker pier, which was to terminate in this incredible diving board into the sea, which is it's the sort of cantilevered at this incredible angle and it looks marvelous, but obviously it never actually happened. Bexhill Museum also has a very good dress collection. If you're interested in fashion, I definitely recommend going there. But I like the ephemeral bits and pieces. So my attention on this photograph here is drawn to that tube at the bottom right-hand corner, which is called a Sun Fun inflator. And I just wonder how many of these 1960s airbed inflators have managed to survive over the decades. And I'm guessing it's not very many. And that's the kind of thing that, you know, can bring back memories, has that power, even though it's something very simple. Behind it also, we have this wire hanger and basket arrangement, and these were introduced in the 1930s as a way of storing clothes whilst bathing from either the beach or the lido, so that you could put your clothes in there and hang it up and somebody else could go into the changing cubicle after you. I'm staying on bathing a bit and models. So here is Bognor Regis Museum, which I visited in April this year. It's easy to see the value of a model, an architectural model, when its subject is as important as the Delaware Pavilion. But this is a model of the Riviera Lido holiday camp at Nyetimber, which opened in 1938. And generally, holiday camps are not really considered as, well, they're often not considered as architecture at all. They're sort of too mass entertainment and below comment as far as architectural historians are concerned. But I think that's why this struck me as important, because this demonstrates that this holiday camp here was planned, it was designed, it is a space that the function is carefully thought out, and you see that here. And that kind of, I think that's quite important to recognise. The other model isn't a model at all. As in Weymouth, this is a real Bognor bathing machine. It was built by a local builder called Frederick Jenkins in about 1905. His father-in-law ran the fleet of bathing machines at Eastbourne and shared with him the design details of this. So this looks exactly the same as the Eastbourne type. And you can see, even though that is just a mannequin there, that the scale of the wheels on this thing is quite extraordinary. And that's because of the slope of the shore going into the sea. When you have these mobile changing rooms, the point is you get changed on the beach going towards the sea, and then you step out in your bathing costume. We know that they were blue and white, painted like this, because the adverts at the time actually say so. This is my favourite Seaside museum, and if anybody's been there, they'll know why. It's the Longshoremen's Museum on Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, and this is a private collection. The other museums I've talked about are generally local authority. This one is the private collection of the Blake family, who were longshoremen, and as you can see in this poster here, bathing machine proprietors. Now, they've been operating bathing machines at Ventnor since 1857 at least, and the beach huts there that you can go and find when they come out next summer, they are cut down bathing machines, so they are still using the same estate of these timber structures, which has to be the sort of longest running continuous use beach huts, bathing machines anywhere. But what I found extraordinary is some of the sort of peripheral bits that they've got in their collection. So in the top right hand corner, bathing machine wheel patterns. There's something to have a bathing machine, but to actually have the wheel patterns to create the wheels for it, and that's extraordinary. And that is because this is a family collection. The other thing there, and you can see in the circular image, the Victorian buckets used to deliver hot or cold seawater to any part of the town. Ventnor was very famous in the Victorian period for attracting people with tuberculosis who were very ill, so they couldn't necessarily come to the beach. So the water was taken to them in their hotels and lodging houses. And again, it's a very simple thing, but it is a very rare thing. My last museum objects come from Weston-super-Mare. Some in the audience will recognise these. The model was made in 1961 by London architects Chamberlain, Powell and Bonn, and proposed a complete redevelopment of the town centre and seafront. Think about the period that this comes from, the 1960s. This is when foreign competition was becoming more of a challenge to domestic resorts. But at the same time, there was this faith in modernity and a willingness to kind of sweep away historic spaces in the name of progress. And that's what this model represents. Weston-super-Mare was not unique in proposing this kind of huge change. Not many of these proposals, thankfully, went ahead. Brighton did have a massive area of redevelopment, but by and large, our historic seafronts were spared. And I think we can all be thankful for that, because otherwise the Seaside Heritage Network wouldn't really have much seaside heritage to celebrate. But sort of thinking of celebrating, that wasn't exactly what Banksy had in mind for his 2015 Dismaland, what he called his bemusement park at Weston's old 1930s Lido, from which this oversized pinwheel that you see in the main hall at Weston Museum comes. The guide billed it as the UK's most disappointing new visitor attraction. That's how they were marketing it. And Banksy was definitely playing with ideas about the seaside as kind of post-industrial landscape. And that's interesting because we don't discuss that part of the seaside so much. We look back to the Victorians and the Georgians and the post-war, but actually that's part of the story too, the part when we fell out of love with the seaside. And I think that's perhaps something that museums could engage with a bit more, because we need to address what was going on there. My last museum is going a bit further afield, so I'm slightly cheating with this one, because this is the Museum of the Coast in Belgium, and it was dedicated to the entire coast of that country. Admittedly, Belgium has a much shorter coast than we do. If you hop on one of the trams, one of the coast trams, you can do the whole coast in a couple of hours. So quite different to us, and maybe that's the reason for bringing all this sort of seaside heritage together in one place. I did a Google search. I'm not absolutely certain it still exists, because I went there in 2017. But it kind of begs the question of, should there be a National Museum of the British Seaside? And I'm suggesting that you might send me a saucy postcard, but we have time, I hope, to have a little bit of a think about that. And I'm just going to, as Duncan said, I'm going to be shameless and give you a cheeky plug for my new book, because it comes out in 6 months. And today is the first day I've actually been allowed to share the design of the cover image. So this is what I'm going to be talking about next, and we're going to do a seminar about that in the future. But for now, thank you very much for your attention, and I'd love to hear what you think about the idea of a wider seaside museum for the whole country.
That's great. Thank you, Kathryn. Some fascinating objects there as well. I mean, who knew there was a fishing museum in Brighton? Okay, yeah, we got some time for questions. If you want to respond to Kathryn's question at the end, please feel free to put your questions in chat. Can I ask a quick question of Kate? Because I thought it was really interesting. You're saying that you were going to consult with the local community and you wanted them to be involved in telling the story of Weymouth in the new museum. So how are you going to go about that?
So that will be something we develop over the next 2 years as part of our lottery development project.
Uh-huh.
So that we'll be talking to community groups, talking to businesses. So, the working history of Weymouth is something we would like to explore more of. We have large collections from breweries, and things like lemonade sellers, but more about the businesses. So Rossi's is a long-established ice cream company in Weymouth. We hope to include them in the new museum, and others who are providing services to the seaside and helping Weymouth's wealth growth.
Okay, that's something we'll look forward to seeing that when it reopens the next couple of years. Probably because we don't have any questions in chat yet, but this question for John and Kate. What do you think the difference between a museum and a visitor centre is? I very much doubt there's a hard and fast definition of each, but how do you see the difference?
Museums have obviously got more real objects. I think that's probably the main difference. So, but then some heritage centres are collecting. John?
I would say that I think a museum has a collection normally of artifacts, and that's something that our visitor centre doesn't have and doesn't aspire to have. And museums generally have to seek accreditation, don't they, or belong to professional associations. So maybe that's another difference.
So they're both telling stories in a way, but museums have a collection of objects in addition.
Yes, and we are rationalising our collection at the moment because there's an awful lot of material that doesn't really belong to the Weymouth story that we will pass on to other museums elsewhere.
Okay, so the objects are kind of circulating, are they?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we're also looking at collecting new objects in areas that we're missing, like the sort of 50s up to the present day, which we have some material on, but we could collect a lot more, and we can collect more of the stories that go with it. I think one thing that was missing in the past was the information about those collections. So now we have the opportunity to record people talking about the object they're giving to the museum. You get a lot more out of it.
And we're fortunate in as much as we can borrow artifacts from local museums as and when we need to support a particular exhibition, which works very well for us.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. We've had two questions to Kathryn from Kirsty and Rachel, and to be honest, I was about to ask the same question. Where do you think would be the best location for a National Museum of the Seaside?
See, well, maybe that's the reason we don't have one, because how would you choose? And maybe it depends on finding a place where there isn't a museum. I mean, it's going back to Dorset again, but actually Bournemouth, despite being one of the biggest seaside resorts in the country, does not have a museum, a proper museum of its own, let alone one that celebrates the seaside. It has the Russell Coates Museum and Art Gallery, but that isn't a history museum in the same way. I think when we first started the network, we were talking to the heritage people at Dreamland in Margate, and they were mooting ideas of having something in Margate. Margate used to have a really fantastic museum, but it did close down for a while. I'm not quite sure what's happened to it since. I think that the experience from visiting the stores in the Russell Coates Museum in Bournemouth, which we had the privilege to do last year, was that actually there's loads of stuff there. There's probably loads of stuff in stores, in museums around the country that could actually be brought together to tell a national story, because there's so much overlap. Things were happening at the same time in different places. So it's more than a local story, I would argue. But someone, I think, had put in the idea of maybe an online museum. And maybe that is a more realistic way of making that happen, if sort of coastal museums could contribute to a wider sort of online seaside museum, that might be something that we could pursue. I don't know in the future, but yeah, it's nice that there is kind of comments suggesting that that might be a worthwhile thing.
Okay, thanks. We've got a question from Louise, and I think this is probably for Kate and John. What support is out there for voluntary organisations that run smaller scale museums to help them develop the offering for more modern audience tastes? Difficult question.
Well, I recommend people to go and talk to their local museum development officer, which I think pretty well all counties have one of these.
Is that a local authority post?
Those are posts, they're supported regionally by the Arts Council, but they may also get some support from a local authority, but there is one in each county, and I think you can find details of them on the Association of Independent Museums website, AIM.
Okay. John, anything you want to add?
I would just add a comment which may not directly address the question, but I think one of the most frustrating things for me about grant funding is funders are always looking for you to do something different or to hit a particular objective that they have. What they're reluctant to do is to provide you with the core funding that most museums and visitor centres need to pay for the unexciting things like staffing, utility costs, and so on, which are the really big sort of challenges for running a small building.
Very true.
Okay, thank you. We've had a comment from Paul Doe, who was our special guest at Western. Yeah, can we encourage museums to capture more detail on our lost heritage? Yeah, I think that's something all museums would like to do. Anything, Kate or John, you want to add to that?
We'd be delighted to. Yes,
Yes.
that's something we would hope to do over the next 2 years. Yeah.
Okay.
Just thinking about Weymouth. One of actually my favourite building in my new book is the Weymouth Pavilion, the 1958, I think one, and that replaced a fire damaged building. And there were so many fires. Not just demolitions of these buildings, and so much lost in the war, actually, that sort of capturing some of that demolished and lost those buildings that was something we sort of considered for a sort of nationwide exhibition would be rather interesting. But I know lots of museums do have that information about the lost buildings. But Paul's absolutely right to say that if it's a good way of persuading people now to look after what they've got. When you see what you've lost, it's a bit of an impetus, isn't it, to fight harder for the stuff that's still there.
Yes, it's the anniversary of the fire in that theatre this year, and some film of it burning down turned up this year in. Somebody bought it in a job lot of film, so we were delighted to be given a copy of that film of the theatre burning down.
Really interesting question from Molly, which I'll put to all three speakers, about how can museums better respond to the topic of class and seaside heritage. In a way, one of the reasons that seaside heritage is so neglected is that it's associated with working class histories and cultures. Any comments on that?
I mean, absolutely. I think that's partly why I put happiness in as a one of our themes. And Weymouth being a party town, it's very much a working class party town, and we really want to capture that. So this is people going on holiday places. This is from all classes, but a lot of working class history and that. I think museums, they don't look at sort of fun things that often. It tends to be education and things that are good for you. So I think just fun has been looked down on a bit in displays in the past. But we want to change that.
That's interesting, because when we were looking at potential museums, we're looking at lots of museum websites. And although the museums were in seaside towns, often they didn't say anything about the history of tourism in that seaside town. It was almost completely overlooked. John, Kathryn, anything you want to be add to that?
I don't know.
Yeah,
Sorry.
one thing that we're looking at in an exhibition we're planning at the moment for next year is the varying classes who were involved in accommodation or providing accommodation or visiting, from academics or royalty who came and stayed in accommodation, through to the landladies who were responsible for providing the accommodation and looking after them while they were visiting, and sort of comparing and contrasting the different experiences that they had.
Kathryn, anything you want to add?
I don't know whether Sue wants to comment on this because she's got her hand up.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Sue.
Well, a couple of things actually. So on the class issue, I don't know for sure that this will cover Seaside, but one of my many hats is as a volunteer at 2 Temple Place in central London. And just to let you know that their 2025 exhibition, which will run from broadly the end of January to the end of April, I've just recently been informed, is A Life Less Ordinary, which focuses on 1950s onwards working class culture. And I understand that there are going to be aspects of leisure and play and such like in that, although there is a creative arts focus. So whether that will touch on any seaside heritage, I don't know. But the other comment that I wanted to make is that I've also worked pro bono on a couple of research projects and exhibitions, one of which was Snapping the Stiletto, not seaside related, that one, in Essex, but also Last Fisherman Standing in Worthing, which is about fishing heritage when the last fisherman actually left the beach in 2015. And the difference between these two projects in terms of legacy is that the legacy website still exists for all the work that was done for Last Fisherman Standing. It's there, it's accessible. You can see, kind of all the work and the stories that were uncovered, and that kind of exists as a virtual museum, if you like. Whereas for Snapping the Stiletto, around about 2018, 2019, that legacy website was never kept in the same way. And it's just really a kind of comment and a plea that very often in uncovering these stories and doing this work, it's really important, I think, to find a way to keep those legacy websites, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
I think as an interesting point Sue made from the London point of view, because obviously we're talking about holidaymakers. Holidaymakers came from inland cities. And I was interested when I was in Glasgow earlier this year to visit their museum and the People's Museum in the park there, and see they've just closed for a new to do it all again anyway. But the basic point is that they had this display about Glaswegians at the seaside, because it was so important as a part of the kind of annual progress through the year, the Glasgow Fair Week, when everybody got on paddle steamers and went up the Clyde to all these seaside resorts. So if you could have a national seaside museum, you could feed the stories in from the interior, from those cities, and what that actually meant going on holiday. And that's what you never get. You don't get that sort of back and forward of the experiences of the tourists from where they came from and where they went to. And that could be really interesting.
I think the other thing as well, thinking about the class element of that, is thinking about who staffed things like holiday camps and leisure resorts on the coast. And that was very often working class, relatively young people. I mean, a much, much older now deceased relative of mine went away in 1954 to be a chalet maid at Atherfield Bay holiday camp on the Isle of Wight. And this was considered hugely exotic and radical, and a way of, leaving home and spending the summer somewhere, amazing, really. So I think there's a lot of stories to uncover.
Number of interesting comments in the chat. We're reminded that Scarborough is celebrating 400 years as a seaside resort in a couple of years' time. Sam talks about a travelling exhibition using empty retail space in seaside towns. There's a question from Chris about how we fund a national museum. I think we don't have time to go into that now. Phil talks about an online museum that could direct people to local museums. Someone replying, Rachel is replying to Sue, if you want to follow that up. I think that's the end of all the questions, so time to wrap it up. So on behalf of everybody here, can we say thank you to the speakers? Firstly, to Kate for being so ready to take part, and to John and Kathryn for stepping in to help out. So thank you very much, all of you. So a round of applause for everyone, please.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Before you go, can I just mention our annual bucket and spade list? So in case you weren't aware, the winner this year was New Palace and Adventureland in New Brighton. Worthy winner, I thought, although came as a bit of a surprise to some people. But we're running the bucket and spade list again this year, which will be for the 3rd year. So if you'd like to nominate a site for the long list that then goes to the public vote, you can use the link in the chat. You can nominate sites to be on this year's bucket and spade list. It only remains to tell you about our next online seminar, which is the 22nd of January. It's about the Art Deco seaside. This is bound to be popular, so book early to avoid disappointment. So thanks once again to our speakers. Thanks to all of you for turning up, and goodbye.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you
Very much.